In this tutorial, I'm going to show you a variety of watercolor techniques for beginners or anyone trying to experiment with watercolors that creates a really vibrant finished work of art out of practice. All you need is a pan of your favorite watercolors and watercolor paper. Make sure you're using the right water-based media paper. It doesn't have to be expensive, but you're going to be applying a lot of water to your paper. You'll also need a little bit of salt. I know that seems weird. I'll show you. And you're going to need masking tape, or even better, artist tape. If you love learning about art, hit that subscribe button so you never miss an art tutorial. This technique, we're going to tape off different sections using masking tape. This is the wrong tape to use. So if it looks dirty, that's because I took it and I put it on my jeans a few times so it wasn't so sticky. Masking tape will rip your paper even if it's thick. The best thing to use is blue artist tape, but since I didn't have it and I like my tutorials to use any material you have at home, not just the expensive art supplies, just make sure if you're using tape that you dull it down by putting it on your sleeve, putting it on a blanket so it's not so sticky. You want to create overlapping layers that are going to be not so small, they're hard to paint, but not so big that it's going to be boring. I have 10 sections of various sizes and shapes, so I feel ready to paint. I'm using PRANG watercolors, and you can use any watercolor paint that you have, and I just love using a round brush. My first technique is so much fun. It's just blending two color washes together. This is a wet on wet technique, and so you really don't have a lot of control because the water is going to dictate how the colors interact. I'm washing my brush and I'm dipping it in my second color, and before my blue dries, I'm going to go to the bottom of that section and I'm going to put a nice purple violet. So you can see the colors are already bleeding together. I am using my brush a little bit. The more water you use, the more the colors are going to kind of swirl together. And you can see, you can always go back and overlap if you feel like one color is more dominant than the other. I just love that technique. I think it's so gorgeous. Down here at the bottom, I'm going to use this small section and I'm going to do a watercolor with salt technique. Paint a section using lots of water and then sprinkle some salt in there, and then you're going to really see the magic happen after it dries. Now I'm using table salt. I prefer to use thicker sea salt for this, but I'd already taken it home. Check out my video above of how to do sea salt to create gorgeous textured backgrounds. With this section, I'm going to paint it green first. And this is a wash, and a watercolor wash is a layer of color that's diluted with lots of water, so it's kind of translucent. It's very good for layering. And so while this is still wet, we're going to use a paper towel and we're going to do a blotting technique to create texture. I'm using the dry paper towel to blot or pull away the paint to create a texture. That looks very nice, but I'm going to actually cover up what I just did and I'm going to see if I can make it more dynamic. I'm taking my yellow paint and I'm doing a wet on wet blend just like I did in my first section, and I'm seeing if I can create more dynamic color areas. Now that I have lots of paint on here, I'm going to take my paper towel again and I'm going to try the blotting technique, pulling away the paint before it dries. That looks really nice and it creates a really lovely texture. It'd be great for a landscape. Kind of makes me think of tie-dye too. Now an additive technique is you can dip the paper towel in the paint and then dab it on there to create textured areas that you're adding instead of pulling away. So experiment with both of those and experiment with different types of colors to create either light and faint areas or more contrasting areas. Now I'm going to find an old kind of hard brush that I used to use with acrylic paint and do kind of a stamping technique. This also creates texture, and I'm not messing up a new brush, but I'm using kind of the texture and the randomness of the old brush to stamp on different areas. I really love that texture, and again, that'd be great for a landscape. So I started out with just blue, and sure, I could stop there, or I love the color blend. What would happen if I added a second color and stamped on top of that? That purple magenta color looks really nice, and if it subtly blends, it creates another color in there as well. This area might be my favorite. Now I'm going to use black and create shading, or almost a value scale in this triangle. So this takes a little bit of control because I'm using more water. I want it to go from black and then create dark to medium to light grays. So each little section, I'm rinsing my brush and removing some of the paint, as you can see. And I think I have a little too much water on my brush because it's all wanting to bleed together. It does take a lot of control to get a shaded area with watercolor because water is going to do what it wants to do. Worst case scenario, take a paper towel, blot away your color, and try again. Certainly that's what I'm doing here. So if you have too much water, just kind of pull it away with the paper towel, get a brush and kind of wipe it as dry as you can, and then pull the paint down. It's easy to get your dark area because overlapping is in your control, whereas the water is, a little bit trickier. So this section does take a little bit of practice. I'm using a crayon to create areas of resist. So crayons have a lot of wax, and wax and water resist each other. You can also do this with oil pastels, but I have a white crayon right here, and you can use whatever color you like. I just think the white looks really cool. The downside of white is that you can't really see what you're doing if you're doing it on a white piece of paper. So I'm just putting like little tick or hatch marks to create just a beautiful texture design that's pretty simple. Now, once you have your design, this is the really cool part. Get whatever color you would like. And then when you paint over all of your crayon marks, watch what happens. Now, depending on how much paint you use, the results will be different. Look at that. So I'm going to spread it out, and then you have your marks there, and it's just such a fun way to create textures and designs. You can also do this with a product called masking fluid, but if you don't have it or you don't feel like buying something expensive, you can use a white crayon or try it out with oil pastels too. I just think the crayon wax is a little more gentle on the brush than the oil pastels. I'm going to try my hand again at the shading, this time using blue and less water on my brush. So you can see how it's not traveling, taking a little bit of water, wiping it away, pulling down that blue to get that a little bit of a lighter value, repeating that step again, pulling that blue down with a little bit more control of my brush, and you can see that it's not warping into each other because of the water. So that's a good thing. Now I'm taking almost all water on my brush and pulling. And then remember, if you want to create a lighter area, get a paper towel and blot it. And if you want to create a darker area, you just get in there and layer until you feel it looks right. This is just a way to practice. It's a great way to practice techniques and brush control. So there might be certain colors that work really well for you. You might have good luck the first time and not so great the next. It just depends. Painting is an adventure for sure. So I'm very gently pulling that color down into that white area. I feel a little bit better about this one than I did the black section. And now I'm going to just repeat some of those techniques that I really loved. I love a wet on wet wash. I love how unpredictable it is. And this time I'm going to do magenta. I'm going to blend orange right into it. Look at that water traveling. And I'm going to end with a yellow. So feel free to do a gradient. Feel free to do colors that aren't just two going into each other. And that's making just a gorgeous swirl of color. And it will dry even more beautifully because the water is going to evaporate in ways you can't predict. Now I'm going to move on and I'm going to do some more blotting, going back to my green, trying to make it a little bit darker this time, and I'm blotting with my paper towel to make my textured areas, and then I'm actually using that green over in the other section. So this is a wet on dry technique because that section is dry and I'm adding a little bit of wet paint to it. So there's a lot of different ways that you can work with watercolor. Blotting again just to see if I can create a little bit more texture and layering. So don't be afraid to layer with watercolor once it's dry. Blotting in some yellow as well, and I think that's a really nice textured area that shows a little more nuance of color. My paper towel got a little bit dirty there, but no big deal. I'm going to get out that old brush again and do some textured over that green now that it's a little bit more dry, so maybe the texture stands out a little bit more. Play around with color combinations that you like. That blue looks really nice with the green, and I think it just stands out because, as you can see, the top section was wet on wet, so it kind of like blended into each other. Okay, let everything dry before you do this next step. So our final technique is actually the first one we did, and it's the masking we did with the masking tape. You can see that it's very dirty because I wiped it on my dark jeans, and you're going to also see in just a minute why it's important to not use, there's that tear, masking tape, but to really use painter's tape because it's designed for surfaces like this. So if you tear your paper a little bit because you use masking tape like me, it's not the end of the world, and art teachers, don't come at me. I know I was using the wrong material, but I just wanted to see if I could make it work. It is so important that your sections are dry, or else you're going to have lines that the paint will kind of bleed into. So I'm trying to like remember which tape is on top of which, and I'm trying to pull in a way that's not going to mess anything up. And I ripped my paper again. So that's a life lesson for you. Make sure you're using the right materials, or if you're doing it cheap like me, just know that, you know, if you're using cheap materials, you're going to get those results, but it still works. So you can also be careful if you feel it pulling, try going the other direction. All right, success. I love these areas. It was really fun to create, and I love that it made just a finished work of art out of like practice skills. Thank you so much for sticking around and making art with me. And if you're interested in more watercolor tutorials, check these out. If you're also interested in what my students are doing in my classroom, find me on Instagram at @thatartteacher_Machado.